Hello folks, I'm just getting a few paintings ready to go in their frames for my exhibition, and the next job is going to be varnishing them. And I thought this would just make quite an interesting video really, because whilst I think probably YouTube is full of videos on how to varnish oil paintings, these guys are a bit different. As you can see, I like to put paint on really thickly. My approach probably shares quite a lot with how everybody varnishes their paintings, but there are 2 or 3 little tips that I've got that might be useful to you if you like painting with a thick impasto finish. Let's have a look. So I varnish my paintings for 3 reasons really. I mean, the classic one is for sort of longevity. I've got no idea whether anyone will want my paintings or value them in 10 or 50 or 100 years time, but if they still are enjoying them, I'd like them to be protected from the grime of life and have the potential to be cleaned up as well. But the other 2, I think, firstly is that I've always worked in quite dusty workshops and my paintings tend to stay with me for a while, and so I want to kind of protect them in what is a fairly hostile environment. And then the last reason is that there is quite a lot of weak paint in my paintings, because very often I use a terpsy wash before I start painting. So if you look at this painting, you can see in the sky, hang on, I'll get it here for you, up here, although there's really thick paint, this is a very weak paint which has been painted on with a lot of terps. And as I understand it, the more terps you have, the weaker the paint is. You've got less pigmentation and the paint is weaker, and I'm sure that if I were to scratch that now, that would probably scratch off, so I'm looking to protect these really thin areas of paint. Now in terms of the process, I suppose the 2 kind of classic tips are, one is that I use a little brush like this, and I absolutely make sure this is for nothing but varnishing. It's a really clean brush that I use it solely for varnishing, and I clean it every time with white spirit and put it away clean and dry. The second thing is I have another dedicated brush, as you can see, which is for dusting paintings off, and before I do each painting I vigorously brush it off. Now what I've noticed, I brushed these off a minute ago and already they're dusty again, so each one needs to be brushed off just before you varnish it, and ideally not where you're varnishing your other paintings, for the obvious reason that you cover them in dust. Take it away, brush them elsewhere. You know, the paintings are pretty tough, give them a really good, a really vigorous back and forth with the brush. Otherwise, anything that's left on there is going to get incarcerated in a gloopily prison of varnish forevermore. Now, for my top tips, for thick painters like me, my top tips, the first one is that I use a thin varnish. So this is what's called artist's retouching varnish, and I believe it's a very thin, quite porous varnish, which means that you're not wrapping your painting in a thick, airtight wall of varnish. And that's really important with these thick paintings because they are going to take months and months to dry. Some of these are 6 months old. This is 6 months old, and the paint, even now, these thick bits of paint, it's getting there, it's pretty solid. But it will not have finished curing, and a really thick varnish will arrest that process, or, as I understand it, actually mean that you get the varnish will dry at a different speed to the paint, which can result in cracking. So you don't want to use a really thick varnish. Another little tip here is that I mentioned to people when they buy a painting that that's what I've done. If they would like another coat of varnish when the painting is completely dry, that's absolutely fine. Bring it back to the studio in a year's time and I can put it on then. Part of the reason I do this is a commercial one, as it's quite a nice way of getting people through the door again, but so far people seem to be happy with just their single coat of varnish. Life, after all, there are other things to worry about than how many coats of varnish oil painting's got on it. So my second tip is not to apply the varnish directly onto the paintings. The kind of classic approach would be to pour a little puddle of varnish onto a painting and spread it around into a thin layer with your brush. Now this makes me nervous with these thick paintings, because if I were to disturb one of these sort of little blisters, and get a tiny tear, I'd be moving paint in a solution of varnish across the surface of the painting, and we'd really be in trouble. So instead, what I do is I decant my varnish into a clear container so I can see the colour of it. I do a little tiny bit at a time, so if I do have any kind of polluting of the varnish, I can just throw it away. And here's the really useful tip. I then start work on areas of the painting that I know have dried and cured well. You say, how the hell do you know that? I have come to understand from my paints that they dry in this order, that brown dries first, red dries pretty quickly, yellow less so, white less so, and blue dries last. Your particular paints may differ. Mine are Van Gogh oil paints. And you can establish this quite quickly by looking at how, if you leave a few blobs of paint on a palette over the weekend and see which one is beginning to dry quickest. But having established this, I basically start with the brown, work through those colours and finish with the blue. And that way, if I do get a bit of a bleed, I've not spread it over the whole painting. I've kept it within the colour where I'm working. By and large, it's very rare to get a bleed with these paintings. These are all at least 2 months old. But it happened once and I don't want it to happen again. By holding the work up to the light like this, I can just check to make sure that I've got a nice even coverage and I'm not missing any spots, or I've got any big puddles that also I kind of want to avoid. With a really, really impasto-y painting like this one, you've almost got to dance the brush in between the paintwork to make sure you're getting into every nook and cranny. And so that brings me on to my last tip, which kind of follows on to that, and that is to have a piece of white paper handy, and as you're working, to keep just checking that your brush is still working clear. So if in doubt, put a brush load of varnish onto the white paper and make sure it's still clear, and this just keeps you sane, it keeps you honest as you're working across a painting. Well folks, that's 7 pictures done and a completely clean sheet, so no bleeds there, no contamination, don't want that. And I've just popped the paintings over here on the other side of the studio, somewhere flat and relatively dust free. No one's in here today chopping up bits of timber. I also opened the windows because I was beginning to hallucinate. No, I didn't get that bad, but I felt it was possible. To be honest, I'm by no means an authority on this. I'm making it up as I go along, so I'd be really interested to know how you do it and whether there's anything you might suggest I add to my approach. But yeah, this sees me well. Thanks for joining me. I'll look forward to seeing you again soon, and in the meantime, go gently, go well, and keep painting.